It's time for Trench Talk, for your weekly infusion of metal and otherwise heavy music. I'm your host, Flight of Icarus from MetalTrenches.com. As always, if you have not already, please do subscribe to the channel, follow us on social media, or better yet, sign up for our mailing list. Alright, so I'm here with Chris Dahlberg, and you may have read some of his reviews on the website before, and we're going to talk about the new Deathspell Omega album. And I thought that it seems appropriate to kind of talk about it in sort of two parts. I was thinking we could kind of just like talk about the music for the first part, and then in the second half we can delve more into sort of the lyrics and some of the controversy going on here, so that people who don't really want to get into that can peace out after the first half.
And I think it's worth mentioning how quickly this came out. Like, you know, the hype train for this was basically just like, this is coming out in like 2 weeks. And there was pretty much no pre-release except for that one video and the Bandcamp link. And I honestly didn't think that either of us was going to get it like pre-release.
Yeah, I hadn't even really thought about that. But yeah, we can definitely get into that. But first reactions, I mean, you kind of messaged me the first time you started listening to it, and could you kind of share what your initial thoughts were listening to this?
I mean, honestly, the first time through, to me, it kind of felt like, okay, this is definitely Deathspell Omega. And I don't necessarily mean that in a bad way. If you think about kind of all their past recordings and how chaotic and over the top they are, there's definitely a lot of that here. So my first reaction was that, okay, this sounds like what I expect from them. There are some differences. It's definitely more direct and straightforward in a lot of parts, more so than I think they've done in a really long time. If you look at the amount of slower sections that they have throughout the album, it's definitely different. And it's taken a little longer, I guess, to click with me than Synarchy did. I don't know if that's just because Synarchy was so chaotic and crazy and just instantly grabbed me. This one, it seems like it's definitely taken through like 3 or 4 listens to start to appreciate it more.
Yeah, Synarchy is just such a ridiculous, kind of more technical. It almost reminds me more of like a Imperial Triumphant album on some level. But yeah, listening to this, I had a similar reaction initially, and I even started thinking like, it's the same reaction I get listening to sort of the Black Dahlia Murder album. Like, those are such different sounds, but it's the same idea where it's like, before you even start listening to it, you kind of know what you're in for to an extent. I mean, Deathspell's just kind of become sort of everybody kind of knows, if you've been listening to Deathspell, that they have like a certain sound to their guitars and a certain approach to kind of the drums and the vocals, and you just get more of that with every album, with some kind of subtle changes from album to album.
And it was interesting because when Ad Arma came out, I actually wondered if the whole album was going to be more traditional based on that, because that was such a calm song to release ahead of time. You know, that is probably one of the most straightforward songs on the album. It has a very traditional, the riffs don't change as much as they do on the other ones. And I know you would kind of describe it as like, this is the part before it goes insane, which is the next song is definitely, you can tell it's building into that. But to make that the centerpiece of like the pre-release, I thought that was pretty interesting. And I don't know if it was just to throw people off, but it definitely worked.
Yeah, that's become one of my favorite tracks, even though I tend to swing more towards the like really chaotic, harsh, abrasive ones. I like that kind of like almost doomy, haunting, kind of just more atmospheric. There's sort of a groove to it. It's very hypnotic, and it sort of just lulls you into a certain mindset before I forget which track is right after that one, but it is one of the heavier ones. There's a whole stretch right there that's kind of my favorite part of the album.
There's definitely parts of the album where they feel like they're linked musically, like the songs bleed into each other, but then there's distinct parts where that stops and it almost like starts anew. Because I think, like you said, from like Ad Arma until almost like 1523, it feels very cohesive in how they tie everything together.
Yeah, there's definitely a good kind of concise flow to the album as a whole, and the dynamics work out really well in its favor. I've been trying to like move on to like kind of the next albums that I need to review, but I really can't stop listening to it. Like it just keeps pulling me back. And even though it's not what I would say is necessary, I'm already kind of figuring out my favorite 10 albums of the year so far, and I don't necessarily think I'm going to include this in it because there's just so many other ones that I want to talk about, but it's definitely got a certain like infectious quality to it.
It is hard to say since it's coming out so much earlier in the year. Like when Synergy dropped, it was pretty much already the end of the year.
Yeah. I was interested in your reaction overall too, because I'm, relatively speaking, kind of new to Deathspell Omega. Like I've only really been listening to them, I don't know, maybe like 4 or 5 years ago, and you've been listening to them much longer than that.
Yeah, I think I started with the Chaining the Catachan EP, which came out in 2008. That was originally a split with Svest, and then that was kind of one of their first introductions to North America, because I think that Ajna Offensive actually released that, and I hadn't really seen the name around as much, so I went backwards from there and went into Faz and kind of the beginnings of the trilogy, as they say. And I really didn't know what to make of it at first. Like at that time, I mean, that would have been 2008, 2009. I would say my tastes in that genre were probably still more traditional. And this was just so out there. You know, there was so much going on that I wasn't sure if I even really liked it at first. But as my tastes have changed and kind of as everything has gone towards the more extreme and the more complex, as I've reviewed more and more and more over the years that followed, I found that I would go back to it a lot. And especially when like Pericletus came out in 2010, that's kind of when I delved all the way back and kind of started to appreciate it more. And it's interesting that those albums were released in a span of like 6 years, because they really are very focused and they all tie together, but they push the band in different directions while still kind of doing that crazy unorthodox style you would expect. So that's why for me the first impression for this album was, well, it sounds like Deathspell, because the amount of time that I've spent listening to them now, it's kind of like I'd be a little concerned if it was anything different, I guess.
Well, I was interested too, like, do you prefer the older stuff or do you actually like the newer stuff better?
That's hard to say. I think probably Synergy's what I like the most out of the modern stuff. The older stuff can be hard to take in. So I think there's a distinction between kind of what we would consider the early albums. I think when you think of the early albums, you're probably thinking of kind of the two that are most popular, which I can't pronounce the names of. You know, kind of the ones with the crazy cover art, and they're super long, and like that's why I have trouble going back to some of them, even though I like them a lot, because that first one from 2004 is like almost an hour and a half long, and that's pretty exhausting. But going back even before that, before Miko was in the band, I mean, they were pretty much just straight up traditional Dark Throne and second wave black metal at that point. It wasn't until kind of that 2004 album where they went into what they are today. And I think there's a lot of similarities between that. I think I kind of prefer a mix of the two, because you can see they all tie together, especially thematically. They're doing a lot of similar ideas, and musically they are too, although they never repeat themselves. They just are always kind of outside the box. Have you listened to a lot of the early stuff kind of after hearing Synergy and Pericletus and stuff like that, or have you just kind of heard snippets of it?
Yeah, I've gone back and like when I think I was introduced to them, I basically had like a lull in the work I was doing, and I had a lot more free time, and so that's when I started kind of browsing around stuff like Metal Storm and just sort of like talking to people in the community there. I think that was probably around 2000 and God, I want to say probably like 2014, 15, thereabouts. And so yeah, it wasn't really until then that I was kind of introduced to Deathspell. And then, of course, they kind of recommended the older stuff, and to me, the older stuff is still kind of the ones you're talking about, where they were coming into their own sound. I'm not even kind of going all the way back to it's the older stuff to me, because I was like 10 years late to hearing any of it. And So I listened to it some, but it's kind of like what you were saying. It took me a while for it to kind of acclimate and sort of make sense. But I, became initially familiar with them through their newer stuff. And so that's kind of like, I like the newer stuff more, is that just tends to be like the albums you hear first tend to become like your favorites. And so I probably need to go back and kind of listen to the the farther back albums again to see if that's changed even further. But yeah, I mean, I've said that like Synarchy is actually my favorite thing that they've done personally, and that's like super recent. And so I'm always interested to hear from like longer time fans what their thoughts on it are.
Yeah, and I think you have to have a pretty significant chunk of time to really get into it too, which I know with the amount of albums we get is not really an option in most cases. I mean, it's so hard for me to go back and even stuff that I like have time to go back and devote
Yeah.
an entire album's worth of time to it when it's like I have 10 things that I could be writing about that aren't out yet. I almost feel like you have to pick out like an evening and just do that sometimes to get back to old albums.
Yeah, and I think that's another thing I have a thought on with this album is like I was picturing other people like myself that coming to this band late. Like if this was the first Deathspell album they heard, like they'd probably think it was completely amazing. Like it would tear their brain apart. And if they're just not familiar with this style, then it's definitely going to be like a top tier album for you. Like I really like this album a lot, but I still didn't even put it past a 9 just because like I've already spent the last couple of years listening to so much stuff. And one thing that really did stand out to me is like, even though Deathspell is like a big part in kind of starting this style, and so many people kind of copied it or were inspired by it, and now there's like a million other bands doing this same style, and it's kind of progressed beyond what Deathspell is doing. So like particularly I was thinking of the newest Imperial Triumphant album. Like there's a band that's clearly been influenced by Deathspell, but I feel like they've kind of transcended what Deathspell are doing and are doing something even more innovative, more interesting, more kind of out there. And so that's just another thought I had listening to this album, is that even though I really like it, I feel like in the big scheme of things right now, it's just not quite as compelling as some of the other stuff that I'm hearing from newer bands that are sort of kind of taking it in new directions now.
And I would agree with that. I think Deathspell is weirdly orthodox in how unorthodox they are, if that makes sense. When they started that kind of sound, they had a very kind of direction in mind, and they haven't really deviated from it that much. Like they're very set in how they approach it. And I think, I mean, going back to their roots, they've done like maybe one interview, and that was back in 2004, and you can tell there's a very strict, rigid thought process there. So I think they probably don't look for any outside influences or even really care what people think about it, which keeps them in a very specific sound, which is good and bad. And I've been curious, based on what you said about if this is people's first Deathspell album, because a lot of the other reviews I've seen outside of yours have been much higher, much more like pure gushing. And you have to wonder about that. Like, are they actual like fans? Are they coming into this for the first time? Because people don't usually mention that when they write stuff like this.
Yeah.
So I'm always curious to see where that comes from.
Yeah, it's a good point, and I'd be curious about that as well. Because I mean, I fall into that too with certain bands that like it is my first album coming in, and so my reaction is going to be very different from someone else's. And that actually, ironically, well, not ironically, but that's part of why I developed like the 3-number rating system, because early on when I was just kind of doing the 1-number ratings, I got accused of kind of just giving everything high ratings, and I honestly think that was fair. Like I was just kind of going off of my gut impulse on it, and like again, a lot of it was stuff that had been out there for a long time and really wasn't all that new and exciting, but to me it was. So it was like falsely sort of inflating.
Yeah, and I still do that too, even with the 3 scores, just because having been writing for 14 years, I've kind of reached a point where I have to like it at a minimum to write about it.
Yeah.
So you have to
Well, yeah.
expect that you're going to be at a 7 or an 8. I mean, I had those days where I just wrote everything I was sent because that's all I could get, and so I wrote about a negative reviews, but these days it's just not worth the energy.
Yeah.
And I think when I do approach stuff, was part of the reason it takes me so long to do reviews sometimes is that if I've never heard the band before, I'll try to like YouTube some clips of their old stuff just
Yeah.
to get an idea of whether it's different or not. And sometimes that actually has the opposite reaction to what I'm trying to do, and then I end up listening to the old albums for a day. And I'm like, oh, I was supposed to write up the new one. Whoops.
Oops. Yeah, it's hard to balance that. Yeah. Like you want that perspective, but there's just like not enough time. Especially when like I'm coming into a band that has like 10 albums already and this is the first one I've heard. Like it's it's hard to like really capture that full perspective. And yeah, you can like catch a song here or listen to like one album or whatever, but it's not really going to give you the full scope of kind of where they've been and like where they're at right now and how they got there. But yeah, and then even just if you're not used to listening to that style, like that's why I tend to just like shy away from reviewing doom albums completely, because it's just like not a genre I really listen to. So I'll throw my thoughts out there, but I'll be really clear in the review that like, look, I'm not like a doom fan, so this is very much the perspective of somebody who does not listen to doom like at all.
And that's probably the
Yeah.
perspective I still like about reviews these days, is you get everybody approaching it from a different angle. I mean, there's plenty of garbage reviews out there. There's people that are writing in a way that you can tell it's only so they can get free music. But I like a lot of different blogs just to see, if somebody knows the band more than I do, do they feel the same way that I did or something like that. I know, the value of reviews is questioned these days. I was talking to a friend of mine about that yesterday, and he was saying, it's not like the old days where you had to buy a CD and you had no idea what it would sound like unless the magazine like mentioned something about it. Everything's so accessible now. So I think the way that we put our opinions on actually gives people like a different viewpoint. And I hope people appreciate that.
Yeah, yeah, it's nice to get a bunch of different perspectives on things. But back on this album, did you have any particular like favorite parts of it, things that really stood out to you?
Honestly, I was listening to it for about the past hour before we started this, and I'm having trouble having one that sticks out. I feel like the entire 45 minutes just kind of flows, and I'm having trouble picking out specific parts, but that's mainly because there's just so much in there. I feel like that's almost why Ad Arma actually sticks out the most, just because it gives you some breathing room. And weirdly enough, that song actually reminds me the most of Clandestine Blaze and like Miko's main band.
Yeah, we can say a bit on that a little bit. Yeah, yeah,
But
but
musically that does, because
yeah,
his project is, he has a lot of slower sections, particularly in the new albums.
yeah. Again, like I'm just partial to the kind of faster, more chaotic stuff. I think the first song that really leaped out at me was Splinters from Your Mother's Spine. What a great title, too. That's like a really just vicious sounding title for a very vicious sounding song. And then Imitatio Dai right after that. Um,
They're like song
Renegade
titles are
Ashes, too.
weirdly like normal this time.
For them, yeah, for relatively speaking, I would say so. But it is kind of a nice mixture though of just like you've got the more kind of synarchy sort of sounding tracks, but they're mixed in kind of, you said before, sort of it's a more progressively structured album, whereas that one was just sort of balls to the wall, just constant sort of, it's almost more of like a tech black album, if you will, the previous one, whereas this one has that kind of smoother, more kind of a lot of ups and downs to it.
Yeah, Synergy was almost like pure showmanship. It just, they want you to know how hard they can hit you, and they just don't stop. And this one has natural pauses where I almost feel like the vocals stand out more this time around than what I remember in the past, just because there's so many more portions where the vocals are the loudest element.
Yeah, and it's a strong vocal performance. It's very just kind of prophetic sounding, and it definitely, like, you hang on to it, like you're you're listening to what he has to say. And I will say, like, I wasn't even really looking at the lyrics until later on, and wasn't even really paying it. It's not so much about what he's saying, it's how he's saying it, I guess, is the best way I can put it. Like, and that's kind of how I listen to a lot of music in general, is I'm not really focused in too much on the lyrics unless they're like super obvious and in your face. Like, for the most part, it's more about the delivery than the actual words.
Yeah,
And
I've
yeah,
always said when reviewing stuff, like, we usually don't get the lyrics, so I don't have time to dive into them. But for me, if I think that something, I'll mention it when something stands out a lot, like you said, whether it's delivery or if it's the opposite side, like when you have the death metal bands that have the dumbest satanic lyrics you could ever hear, feel like they were written by like a 10-year-old, then I might
yeah,
bring that up because I'm just like, really? You guys are in your
yeah,
40s, like,
yeah,
this is a little bit
exactly.
dumb. But I do definitely like the way they're delivered here and the way that, you know, they say we and everything comes from like this almost higher power kind of viewpoint is it fits really well with the music.
Well, that feels like kind of a natural segue into talking about the lyrics and themes more in depth. So, for those of you listening who don't want to get into kind of the, I guess we call it, kind of political aspects of this album, you can feel free to peace out now. Otherwise, we're gonna kind of go down a little bit of a rabbit hole here. So, on that, it was interesting when I think you messaged me and were like reminding me that, like, this whole thing came with a PDF of the lyrics, and you're like, have you read it? It's like a book. And I was like, yeah, I glanced at them and it was cool that they had that, but I hadn't really looked at them. So then I just, like, for some reason I was just kind of Googling, and maybe I was also wondering why the traffic on the review was so high. And I was trying to figure out where all that traffic was coming from. But in any case, I was like looking around, and then I stumbled on like some Twitter posts, and that's when I became aware of some of the, you mentioned like the glowing, super positive reviews of this album. I stumbled on the people who were saying, don't review this album, don't talk about this album because it's a bunch of like NSBM, uh, you know, a call to arms, basically, was the way that they put it. And I was like, "Whoa, what?" Like, because I wasn't. Again, I'm relatively new to this band, so I didn't even know that was like a thing when it comes to Deathspell Omega. I'd heard about, plenty of other bands where that was like part of their history, but I did not know that about Deathspell Omega, and so that sent me down this pit, let's call it.
Well, the
Just
timing of all
people
this is
being angry.
hilarious because you had all the McGuire controversy, and so Clandestine Blaze, I think a lot of it comes back to associations again, and I don't think that Miko's ever said anything that was specifically racist, but when you get into the anti-Judeo, anti-Abrahamic religions, that's where you've got your fuzzy areas, and I know he kind of keeps the kind of company that could look wrong. I mean, I don't
Yeah.
know all the specifics, but I know there's enough of it where this all stems from McGuire was his backing band. He did a one-time live set at one of the European festivals a couple years ago, and nobody said anything about it then. But it's we're in this era where everybody's digging up anything that any band has ever done, and so
Yeah.
this came up, and I just thought it was hilarious that the new Deathspell album got announced as this was all happening. I was like, it's probably coincidence, they probably already had this plan, but I wonder if they just like dropped it earlier because they
Yeah,
were just
and
like, fuck you, you know?
that's what I'm wondering too. If they wanted to, like, forestall the opportunity for people to kind of preemptively get mad about it, it all had to happen after the fact. Was there even like did this happen around Synarchy? Because I don't remember any of this happening when the last album came out.
I
But
don't think
all
so.
this
I
stuff
think that was
predates
still
that.
early enough where,
That
because that was 2016, and I don't think we were in that space yet. I mean,
right.
I think if you look back at that point, bands weren't getting blocked from playing shows yet. Like I saw Graham Blyle's Key play Hell's Head Bash. That was either 2015 or 2016. So that was before all that happened. And you know that band would get, I mean, blacklisted
Yeah.
everywhere now.
Yeah, and that was part of why, like, see, this is the irony of this whole movement to me, is that it's all out in the sphere now. Like, everybody's talking about it constantly, but it's like, to me, it draws more attention to it. Like, it doesn't, like, if their goal is to, like, eliminate this from the music scene, I feel like it's having a completely counterintuitive response. And so and for me, it's the same way. Like, I've become cynical about it, whereas like a couple of years ago, if somebody had been like, oh, that's a Nazi band, I would have been like, oh wow, that sucks, like maybe I shouldn't listen to them. Whereas now, if somebody's like, oh yeah, they're a Nazi band, my initial reaction is, are they really? Like, I'm like, or is this just like another outrage mob thing? Like, because it's become such a witch hunt. And so, I didn't completely cast it off. I got interested and was like, okay, I'm going to check this out. So I did spend some time kind of Googling Mika, seeing if I could find past interviews and just get a sense. Because I'm the type of person where I'm not going to take somebody else's word for it. I'm like, okay, there's so many voices out there and so much of it is wrong. And I want to make sure that, I've got it right. So I did look into things, and I will say, to the credit of this particular controversy, I get it. Like, there was some stuff that I came across that I was like, okay, that's beyond just like what I usually call like the 7 degrees of Kevin Bacon kind of association that is often there, where it's just like, oh, this guy, no, yeah. No, yeah, it doesn't seem like it. Like, I've seen some of the pictures that are like not really great. I mean, you could argue that like it's just black metal artists being edgy, as they have been since the very beginning. I mean, controversy is sort of tied into the whole genre. But I mean, there was other stuff he said. There's a snippet from an interview, and I couldn't find the full context to like confirm that this was actually something he said, but he did say something along the lines of like, I don't specifically dislike like or want to, act against a specific race, but I have a problem with like the street N-words. And there was some stuff there that I was like, oh, okay. Like, yeah, this is not some dude that yeah.
But what's interesting here is actually a funny aside is I've been like reading the Nuclear War Now forums a lot, and one of the first things that they say is, well, Miko's saying we will grant you freedom from freedom. That's gonna blow up. Just like that line. And I thought that was pretty hilarious, but I don't know that he necessarily writes the lyrics. I've always got the impression that some of the other guys in the band do, and he just sings all of it. So that part I'm not sure about. And you're also talking about a band that's never going to play live. So it's kind of like, what is this controversy actually going to do? You're telling people not to listen to this in the privacy of their own home, but it's never going to be performed on a stage because the band has specifically mentioned they don't ever want to do that.
Yeah. And again, in my experience, like one of the things that has floated through my head a lot, and I've used this analogy for other situations, it's like even if Mika is as terrible as you think he is, like because these people outright think that he's like trying to do like a call to arms again and like basically get people to rise up and incur violence like against specific people and races and whatever. It's like, okay, if you think that he's that bad, if he's like literally Hitler, then like to me, I describe people as that like stray dogs. And with stray dogs, if you try to back a stray dog into a corner, you're not going to like the outcome. Like, and that's, I think history proves that. And like my work in mental health has absolutely proven that. Like a lot of the kids I work with are basically those stray dogs who are being backed into a corner by their parents, by the schools, by, various people out in their community that are causing them to become more violent. And it really is like that. The more you push something, the more it pushes back. And so I argue that even if their goal, which if we're just taking it at base value, it's a good one. Like we want less, violence towards people of, you know, of all races and of all factions and whatever. And like, yes, that's a good thing. However, like, I feel like the solution that is at play here is creating more of a problem. If you're dealing with a stray dog, you're going to have a much better response if you know, put out your hand and, you know, assert yourself, but you're giving it space. You're offering it like food. You're trying to show it that like you're safe, like you're a friendly person that they can talk to. And it always brings me back to like talking about people like Daryl Davis, who, you know, black blues musician who goes out and spends time in the homes of KKK members and gets to know them and just talks to them and is just an affable person towards them. And that is ultimately what leads them to leave. Like, because there's all these protests where like you go out and you protest the KKK and you scream in their faces and you call them fascists and Nazis and whatever. And do they leave? No.
Exactly.
Like, that's outrageous to think that'll happen.
My argument about some of this is that we're really on the fringes here, right? So we're in a music scene. If you say something like, oh, this person would actually try to incite it through their music, if they were to go to like an actual like white supremacist compound or something like that, they would not fit in at all. You know,
Yeah.
Our music is so out there to begin with that it's like, I don't think you would appeal to the organized versions of these with that. And to me, somebody putting that energy into music, I'm like, sure, you could try to convince them or, you know, try to turn them away from those views, but putting it towards music is much better than somebody going out and doing like a lone wolf shooting type thing.
Yeah.
Which I don't see that happening from any of the musicians that are in the scene. I mean, you could argue that sure, there might be some fans that get, you know, influenced and do something like that, but the actual people making the music, I don't see them going out and doing anything like that. That's just my view. It doesn't necessarily make it better, but I don't see it as gigantic of an issue as kind of the mobs make it.
Yeah. No, and I think that's fair. And that's another thing I've been thinking too, is it's not illegal to have shitty thoughts. Like, it's not illegal to have bad opinions. And it would be bad if it was. Like, it always makes me think of like a Minority Report kind of situation. Like, do we really want like pre-crime where we're like judge, jury, and executioner of people just because they had a lousy attitude? And admittedly, if what people are saying about the band or Mika or whatever in the lyrics is true, then like, yeah, those are not great opinions. However, they're still just thoughts.
And it's human psychology. You're never going to fully get rid of negativity or counter views. It's just how human nature is. I mean, it's fine to speak out against it, but I think, like you've been saying, the overt banning of a lot of this, or it really is just creating the opposite effect. It's creating more publicity. It's, you know, nobody knew about any of these bands, like, except for the underground, like years ago.
It's ultimately giving it more power, which I think is when it could become more dangerous ultimately. But again, like, to me, the best antidote for that is, and I was also, you know, this brings up that article that was recently put out that guy supposedly got like kicked out of a show because of a like goat moon patch that he had
and that's
on his
an interesting period because I know most of the people involved, so
yeah, because that was in your area, right? Wasn't it at like the Maryland Death Fest? So
yeah, it was at the bar
that's
by my
crazy
house,
to me,
and
though.
I know the bouncers, and you know, I get both sides of that. You know, it's a private bar, and I get the people are on edge here for different situations, but you know, I feel like I could argue either side of it.
Yeah, I get it, and at the same time, I'm like, if you're dealing with people who hold lousy opinions, the best antidote for that is to welcome them into the circle. Like, let them, like, you know, because if they get deep enough in and they start to recognize that, like, oh, these people who have different opinions than mine are actually pretty cool and they're welcoming, and like they you know, give me my space to say my piece, but that gives them space to recognize at one point that, like, oh, maybe I'm wrong. Like, again, just like with Daryl Davis, like, he's hanging out with these people and they have this idea that like black people are, you know, lower than them and they're scum and they're bad people or whatever. And here they have this guy who's black in their house, like being super cool, just hanging out with them, not giving them a hard time. And like, they ultimately can't keep that same idea in their head anymore because it's being actively contradicted in front of them.
And I feel like
And
that's how
so
things used to
they
be.
change their mind. Yeah.
Like that's how the approach used to be for a really long time, and now we've gone to this like total radical no acceptance of anything. And I think you and I have talked about this before, being more on the center side of the political spectrum. You know, I've got views that fall both left and both right. Like nobody welcomes me anywhere. It's like you bring up one to the other and they're just like against you, and you're like, but you could take points from both, you know? And that's kind of how societies function.
Yeah, people even argue that it's like, well, if you're a centrist, then like you don't take a side. But that's not necessarily really what it is. It's just that you're willing to actually listen to both sides of the argument and really think through it before you form your own opinion. And your own opinion may land you more or less kind of on one side or the other, but it's just more, I think, that willingness of not to play team sports. You're not all one side or all the other. You're listening to both sides. You're coming up with your own sort of abstract thinking on it. You're being constructive about it, and then some of your opinions may lean towards one side, and some of them may lean towards the other side. But you're just, you know, you're taking it all in.
Yeah,
God
that's
forbid.
essentially how I like to look at it. And so that's why it's like, you know, having been raised kind of on the left side of the aisle and seeing where things are now, especially with all, you know, the music controversy and all like the constant protests and stuff like that, it's just exhausting.
It really is, and it's frustrating because, like, to me, at the end of the day, like, this is supposed to be like kind of an escape, like entertainment, like a place too where people can come in. And you know, people have come back and been like, well, the metal scene and the punk scene and whatever have always been divided, and there's been sub factions, and yeah, that's true. But like, I just always preferred the side of it where it was sort of a safe haven for a bunch of weirdos to get together and just have a good time and just enjoy something that was sort of different, instead of it just being yet another place to call each other out and get into stupid arguments and fights. And
that's what's almost frustrating now, is how much power these movements have. Like, it's almost like you feel like you could write about the wrong album and then people will try to dox you and get you fired from your job.
Yeah. Well, even having this conversation right now, it's so crazy to me. And again, like, I get, like, the evidence is there in this specific case. If we're just talking about Mika and Deathspell, like, I get it. Like, I'm not gonna be there's some bands where I'm in the argument of like, I think they're just outright wrong and they have bad information and whatever. But with this specific case, I'm like, okay, I get the evidence towards that this dude holds some ideals that are probably not very savory and not really a good thing. But again, it's just, to me, like, the execution of it, like, what do you do with that? And I feel like it's all ending up being counterproductive. Like, you're just giving it more and more power. And the other thing I think too, just from going back to the idea of like black metal is, as Hoist from Take has said, like, black metal's not supposed to be safe. It's all supposed to be kind of dangerous, which was his explanation for some of the stuff he's done in the past. And I think there's probably some of that here. And somebody even posted a response to my review on, I think it was Instagram, basically saying that Mika said in an interview, and I'm probably going to kind of mess this up, but more or less the summary was that Mika recognized that the usual tropes that used to be dangerous, that used to shock people, don't really work anymore. Like, you know, just talking about violence or even Satanism or whatever. Like, people are so like used to it. We live in a society now where a growing number of people are atheists. Like, Christianity and just organized religion as a whole, like, doesn't have quite the same stranglehold that it used to. And I'm not going to sit here and argue whether that's a good or bad thing, but it's just putting that statement out there. Like, more and more people don't really adhere to a specific religion. So when they hear satanic bands, it's kind of like whatever. And there's so much like violence and sex and whatever on all versions of media now that we're sort of like numb to it. So I think part of this is just some of these black metal musicians who really still want to stay on the fringes and want to get that reaction, want to get that shock out of the listener and that discomfort, will turn to subject matter that will evoke that reaction. And right now, that very much is the hot topic. We've given power to all this stuff around race and social justice and all that. So some of these bands, I think, are turning to this imagery not because they believe in it and not because it's what they want, but because they know that is the hot button that is going to get people upset, and they make upsetting music.
And it's also not really surprising in the scheme of things, since the majority of this music comes from Scandinavia. I mean, Mikko's from Finland. You know, that's a very homogeneous population. You know, and obviously that's changed with like the movement, like refugees and things like that. But I think that's where you get a lot of this, is you have a very similar white population. And it's almost like, if you think of like growing up white middle class, you made jokes about things and now you're like, ooh, that's kind of bad.
Yeah.
But, you know, it feels like some of that's in the scene there. Like, you know, they don't have anybody in their country that's going to call them out on that kind of stuff.
Yeah. So again, to me, all the better for like it to be an active conversation instead of trying to just push it out of the stratosphere, so to speak. But again, I mean, at the end of the day, I don't know these people, and that's what I always lean back on. Like, you know, if Mika by some odd chance happens to listen to this and give a shit about it, like, you're more than welcome to come on here, and I'd rather just have a conversation with you face to face. Like that's like, I tend to not pass final judgment on anyone until I've had a chance to actually talk to them. And sometimes that leads to me being like, oh, you know, this person's got a lot of issues, and sometimes it yields like, oh, this person's not at all who I thought they were. And some people argue that, well, they're just going to lie to you and blah, 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 blah. And like, yeah, people can do that. But even when they are, like, they can't hide everything. And, you know, in any case, like, I just think it's important to be willing to do that. Like, I think we'd know a lot more about the situation and bring it to light and diffuse some of it if more people were probably just willing to have those conversations instead of giving it power by making, because right now what it is it's like this big mysterious thing, and that's appealing to some people. So technically you're probably kind of like drawing more new listeners. Like you said, like it wasn't really, this was a very underground band before, and I feel like you're right, more and more people know about this because of controversies and stuff. Like, I didn't even really know who Vorna was until not that long ago, and I think most people are learning about Vorna now through the controversy, and it's really ultimately just free advertising, and they're actually doing pretty well as a result of it, for better or worse.
And that's all, again, associations. I mean, if you go back to all the 90s black metal labels, pretty much every single one had some kind of NS leaning band on there, because there wasn't separation back then. It was just all the underground. So to say just because this label put out this or that and you were on that label, there weren't that many labels out there at the time. You really didn't have any other way to get your music out there. So,
yeah,
you know, it's like, how far are we going to take this? How far are we going to stretch it to say, well, this person knew this and knew this person and knew this label? That's what it's coming down to now.
But ultimately, I mean, people do change. Like, I absolutely can state that for a fact, especially working in mental health. Like, I've worked with many, a child and family too, like with the adults as well, where they came into treatment very much of one perspective and way of thinking and left with a completely different one. And I've seen that happen with bands too. Like, you can argue that Nocturnal Mortem is just putting on a charade and like are just saying that they've changed when they really haven't. But to me, the proof is in the pudding. Like, the music they're putting out now is very different from the music that they were putting out, and they put out a long statement basically explaining that that's not who they want to be anymore, and they haven't engaged in any activity that I'm aware of that would say otherwise. So, like, give people the opportunity to become better people, so to speak, instead of just because if you tell people that they can't change and basically you're not going to treat them any differently ever, and you don't feel like they can change, then that doesn't give them any reason to change, and they just back further and further into the fringes. But again, I think
that's
some
really
of it
where
again
we are
is
now.
Yeah. Oh, it is, and it's awful. But
I'm hoping
again,
to get past a place where we don't ban every single band from playing places.
Yeah. I think the outcome of that would actually not at all be what some of these people think it would be. Like, I think it would be very negative. Like, I think there would be some lasting consequences to that they're not foreseeing, because I think they're just picturing a scene where they've completely obliterated that and it no longer exists, and therefore their scene is now this like safe haven of like all, everybody's happy. But one, I don't think that's possible, because everybody's offended by something. Like for me, for instance, like there's plenty of bands out there who put out songs and song titles about like dead babies and babies dying and fetuses. I mean, God, there's a band called Dying Fetus, and like as somebody who's been through an experience with that, like that's upsetting to me. But I also recognize to somebody else that means nothing to them. And it's not that they're endorsing the killing of infants. It's just that they like the music. And so I can even still listen to that music because I can separate that out and recognize that, like, that's not a personal attack on me. That's just like what a topic they chose to write about. And they have the right to do that. And it makes me think of like Cannibal Corpse too. Like, some of those dudes I heard are like vegetarians, and yet they write these like super violent, gruesome songs about like murder and torture. And it's not because they're endorsing those things. It's not because that's part of their lifestyle and that they think those things are good. It's just that that's a topic that they chose to write about. Because again, they're kind of a shock band. Their job, at least from the beginning, was to make music that caught people's attention and kind of had people clutching their pearls. And that was an easy way to do that. And so, again, just because a band writes about something doesn't mean that they're endorsing it. It just means that that was something that they were interested in writing about for various reasons. And again, another thing I put in there too is that the listener's reaction to it is very subjective. I go back to what I was saying at the beginning. When I was listening to this album, I wasn't even thinking about the words. Like, this wasn't me being like, if people act like this music can somehow like hypnotize you into being a white nationalist. And I'm like, no, I wasn't even thinking about that at all. Like, it didn't even enter my mind. To me, it was just like, oh, this is a sick black metal record.
And the thing with Deathspell is that it's so intelligently, like, the way everything's worded. There could be dual or triple meanings to everything, having not spent a lot of time with it yet. I mean, I know there's references to, like the Purge of the Protestants and that kind of stuff with like 1523.
Yeah.
They're going back, they're looking at like religious persecution, and it almost in some ways seems like they're suggesting that we're just repeating our downfalls again and again, and that's the nature of mankind. And to me, a lot of that's not necessarily like white supremacist uprising. Like, sure, maybe I'll say in a week or two I'll read the lyrics in depth and say, okay, maybe there's some of that, but the way things are worded, it's definitely, when it comes down to it, I don't see a lot of rhetoric like that from just not just bands, but just in general. It doesn't have that same call. It's a lot more plain language when things like that happen.
Yeah, I agree. Like, and that was my reaction to this too. Like, before I had even seen what people were posting about it, I was reading through it and was thinking, yeah, this feels more like it's talking about religion. Like, there's so much religious imagery on there, and it also feels kind of, to me, it feels very satirical at points. Like, it feels like it's being written from the point of view of a person that they know is in the wrong in many situations. Like, and that's just my subjective, again, interpretation of it, which is what's cool about lyrics. Like, I hate it when filmmakers and writers of books and whatever, like, kind of tell you how you should think and feel about something. Like, this feels very open to interpretation. And mine was that I was taking it as the person who's kind of preaching in these passages is very much in the wrong and is being pointed out, like how this is not a good thing, and that they are kind of creating sort of like an apocalyptic situation that is not good. And it almost feels like it's being written at times from the point of view of like what's the word I'm looking for, like super like religious to a fault type person.
Yeah, and I almost can't decide whether it's actually present day or not, because I know like we had talked that the initial reaction was like, it's kind of like on the downfall of modern society and stuff like that, but a lot of it almost reads like from a historical context, they're reinterpreting some of the classic literature, like religious texts and stuff like that. And so it's like it might not even be about now, it might be like an interpretation of hundreds of years ago, just taken through this slant.
Fanatic was the word I'm looking for. It all feels very fanatical, like.
And that's what the and the way that everything's phrased, I definitely can see that.
Yeah. And it wasn't until after I had seen other people's posts that I was like mining through the lyrics again and being like, okay, I could kind of see where that might fit. But again, that's like and that's part of my problem with it too. Like this is a very psychological thing that I deal with in counseling. If you have the mentality of like, okay, I'm always on the lookout for this thing, whether that be like racism or anti-Semitism or whatever. If you're like primed to kind of be wearing glasses all the time that are just tinted with, you're filtering the world you're seeing through that lens, you're going to start finding it. Like anything that you're looking for, you're going to start seeing it everywhere. And so if you're on high alert for white supremacist attitudes, and you're filtering all your information through that lens, again, you're going to start seeing that everywhere. And that doesn't mean it's necessarily there. It just means that you were looking for it, and therefore your brain is going to find a way to make it fit into certain things. And again, with these lyrics, like there's definitely some areas where I could say it's not necessarily as subjective. There are some areas where the lyrics could very strongly, but again, I wasn't seeing it until I was looking at it through that lens. So I worry about people who are constantly using that lens on everything, and we've seen examples of it where they're literally like injecting that meaning into things where it's not there at all. And people are latching onto that though. And it's like, no, you were looking for it, therefore you found it. Like if I wake up tomorrow morning and decide that like there's some, I don't know, conspiracy around the letter U, and that the letter U is everywhere and it's written a certain way to show that it's out to get me, then I'm going to start seeing and noticing the letter U everywhere. And it's like, it was already there, but I'm going to ascribe a new meaning to it now because I'm constantly on the lookout for it. It's a very paranoid way of going through life.
Yeah, it's not a way I want to be.
No. No, I try to take as many of those glasses off as I can, or as Finn so rightly put it in the interview I did with him, that we're recording this actually before it goes up tomorrow, but it will be up by the time I put out this episode. It's part of that veil of Maya idea he was talking about. It's that veil that we put in front of ourselves. It's this illusion of kind of negativity. And it's up to us to kind of like pull away that curtain and recognize things just for what they are. And it's human nature for us to inject our own thoughts and meaning into things. And some of that's a good thing if you're coming at it from a positive angle. But I think it's good to always, as much as you can, start from a default of, okay, I'm just going to take this in and just see what it is. And that's
what I like about stuff like this album as well, is that they're not going to explain it ever. That you take the lyrics as they are. Yeah. And so I can read through them and I can think a certain way. And I don't necessarily have to agree with all the conclusions I come to, but that's part of the interest to me of listening to stuff that's on the fringes. And, maybe it has veiled allusions to things that I'm against, but there's interest in reading that, and especially from historical context too, where a lot of these bands pull some of this from philosophers and other texts that were kind of controversial hundreds of years ago, and now they're being reused. It's all part of, I think, being an educated person and making your own judgments on things.
Yeah, it's a better way to be. So, all that said, if you are one of those people out there who is like super upset with this and feels like it shouldn't even be discussed, like I get your viewpoint, and I'm not going to try to take that away from you. And at the same time, I just want to say to you, like, I feel like your response is counterproductive because, again, people like that want the outrage. Like, they want to generate that free advertising and free shock value through the audience. And so, honestly, the best thing you can do if you don't want this to reach as wide of an audience is to just ignore it. Like, just don't make a big deal out of it. And honestly, that'll have more of the impact that you're probably wanting. Whereas me, like, I just like to talk about things. Like, this doesn't very little shocks or upsets me at this point. So, like, to me, this is just another album in a line of many. I don't even know how much I'm gonna think about this album a couple months from now. I'm sure I'll come back and listen to it, but there's so many other albums this year that are even more impressive to me that this is going to be just kind of a ripple.
And give it another month or two and we'll have the next controversy to talk about and move on to. So from a musical perspective, I'm still a big fan of this one. I don't know where it'll fall by the end of the year, but it's definitely, I recognize it as top notch, especially for them. But I think in the scheme of things and just how much is coming out this year, it's going to be tough.
Yeah, no doubt. Like, there's so much impressive music this year, especially, I know you're not as into tech death, and honestly, I'm not normally that into tech death, but there's just so much impressive stuff in that genre coming out this year, especially through the Artisan era.
Between I Warforged and I acknowledge how skilled a lot of them are. It just, a lot of the technical for being technical stuff bounces off of me because I don't, which is weird to say considering we're talking about a band that does a lot of that.
Yeah. I mean, I'm the same way, but there's just been albums this year that did take it to the next level. Again, I cannot stop bringing up Warforged because to me that's just like such an incredible album that does way more than just be technical for the sake of being technical. There's so many ups and downs, and I think it's just another example of an album that I was even thinking of while listening to this one, where it sort of surpasses what this one's doing because it's just doing more. It's taking in a lot more elements.
Yeah, that I would agree with that. It's weird to describe Deathspell Omega as safe, but that feels like the path
but it is.
They're on at the moment.
To me, and I think that's another thing I want to say to listeners is this album is only as dangerous as you allow it to be. Like, that's a very subjective thing. Like, to me, this is a very safe album. This is Deathspell doing what Deathspell does, and there's nothing that feels overtly dangerous about it. But if you have the perspective that, like, it is this, like, call to action that's going to destroy the world, then yeah. But I argue to you then that you are now the pearl-clutching Reaganites and who's the other one? Tipper Gores of the world now. Like, what we used to do to those people to get them upset, and we would kind of laugh about it and chuckle about it, and that was sort of part of the joke, was these people don't get it. Like, now you're becoming that person. Like, if you're clutching your pearls at this, you're really no better than them, and you're kind of missing the point, and you're exactly the response that these bands want to get. And so if you want to be a tool of that, then by all means be that. But to me, this is just another album. I enjoy it. I think it's done really well. It's enjoyable to listen to, but it's really, at the end of the day, it's no more than that to me.
Yeah, I would agree with that too.
Well, any final thoughts? That feels like a good place to kind of wrap up.
I think we've covered pretty much everything we can talk about without doing like a micro analysis of the lyrics, which would not be particularly exciting for people to listen to.
No. And that'll do it for this week's episode of Trench Talk. Once more, please do subscribe to the channel if you have not already. Give the video a like if you enjoyed it. Consider sharing it with others. Follow us on social media. And one more time, consider signing up for our mailing list, because that's the only way to guarantee that you don't miss any of our content. I send out an email personally every Friday. And again, for you returning listeners who really feel like you're getting added value from this podcast and the other content, please do consider checking out the link to our Patreon account. Just $1 a month makes a huge difference. And at higher tiers, you get more perks like early access to these podcasts and personal shoutouts. Thank you as always for listening. Chris Dahlberg and Flight of Icarus signing off, and we'll see you in the trenches.